Welcome to the last episode of the year, which also marks the end of the very first season of Fain House Radio. I have two things I'd love to tell you about. The first is, as some of you know, each year I put out a wall calendar that includes each of my new paintings of that year. This year's images include everything from the silhouette of a girl on a swing to a sky full of constellations to birds in the sky carrying something unexpected in their beaks. They have titles like Deer in the Land of Wildflower and Three Moons. If you'd like one for yourself, go to the link in this episode's show notes. The second thing I'd like to say is thank you. Thank you so much for listening. I feel shy before I hit record for every interview, and it's been a big learning curve to figure out everything from editing audio to what kind of microphone to get. At the beginning of each episode, when I say, I'm so glad you're here, I really, really mean it. Without you, it's just a couple of folks having a chat. And of course, that's nice too. But I really love knowing that you are out there. And I sincerely hope that the show is adding some sweetness to your own creative life. So in honor of the coming new year, cheers to you. And I wish you much creative action and inspiration in the days to come.
My name is Erica Stankwytch Bailey, and I'm a jeweler in the Asheville, North Carolina area. I thought I was going to do something two-dimensional for a long time. You know, when I was young, high school, by the time I was college, I guess this isn't true, but high school, I really thought I was going to draw or paint. So you would probably find me anywhere and all the time with either a sketchbook or a big drawing board, just jotting down my ideas. But when I was about 17 years old, my mom, who's also really creative, my dad was a musician. My mom's a super creative person. My mom was taking a metalsmithing class at the community college where we lived, and she invited me to take that class. I went and had a great time. I mean, making adornment, making something that you can wear is a very spectacular thing, you know. And so anyway, at 16 or 17 years old, however I was, that was something that I absolutely loved. Fast forward, I went to art school. I went to North Carolina School of the Arts in Winston-Salem for part of high school and a little bit of college. And then I went to ECU in Greenville, North Carolina. When I really got to learn metalsmithing, like sitting down in that first metals class at ECU and understanding how malleable the metal was and how it moved, and that broke all the things that I thought I knew about it. It started a love affair and a fascination that has stuck with me my whole life, 20 plus years later. And so metalsmithing is truly the biggest, longest, broadest, widest creative endeavor of my life. And learning to make, exploring really intense ideas through wearable things, into teaching metalsmithing for a long time, into starting my own business as a maker. And I work in my studio almost every day of my life.
Yeah, because you're right. Sometimes we try this, then we try that, we try different things, and we land on what we're doing now. Yeah. Or we know that we have a hobby to cook or sew or something like that. But that's fun thinking about it being like really purely, truly the thing for you from such a young age. And it has stayed true.
And I think it was that fascinating, I think it was that break, like that, walking into that room and thinking that I understood what I was getting into, and then being like, oh my gosh, I have no idea. And so then I think, being the forever learner that I am, it's always held that space of having more to get to know about it and challenging me sometimes. And how do I iterate it this way? And I don't know. I feel really, really grateful for that. Now, I do love to cook. I'm not a great cook by any means, but give me a pile of veggies to chop and just the thoughts about throwing them. I mean, I've taken 8 billion photographs of piles of chopped veggies in my life because it's gorgeous and the color. And so I guess I feel a little bit creative in almost every part of my life.
Later, if anyone does go and watch this video, they will see you're wearing some really awesome earrings that you've made. They are graphic in design. And it's making me think about what you just said about drawing and painting being something you were into, do you feel like that did help when you were designing your jewelry?
I know that it did because I am still an active sketchbook person. I still draw almost everything. I don't draw well, and I don't mean that in a self-critical way. It's really the throwing out of ideas on paper most of the time just to catch it and to hold it. But I definitely think that spending a lot of time two-dimensionally helped me. And even though my designs are oftentimes really three-dimensional, or they're really inspired by three-dimensional things, I like to take them back down to 2 dimensions, draw them out, and then build things back up. I build things in paper before I build them in metal a lot. Like I use paper maquettes. And so I definitely think that informed the way that I see things and the way that I process the ideas that I have before they get into metal.
That's really fun because it's like those things, like the sketchbook as a portable studio or idea container, and then using paper and things to mock up designs. It's almost like they're a total part of your toolbox and they're a total part of your process. So they aren't separate, actually.
Not at all. And one of the things that I love, which I rarely get to do, is to be able to share with people the design process through a piece, from those original throw it on the paper sketches to the more intense sketches. And then maybe I have more of a love affair with paper than I even realized to this moment. But then there's I keep pieces of carbon paper in my sketchbook and tracing paper. And I do all these things where I flip back and front and back and front, and then into the paper maquettes. And it's really fun to literally see it in a line, like that timeline from the beginning of the conception of the idea through to that metal object, and all those, different pieces that help me figure out how I'm going to make it happen in metal.
One day when you're 100 and it's your retrospective show, you can have on the wall the process that
Absolutely.
led to all this work.
And I feel like it needs to be almost like in a thought bubble, it's like almost needs to be kind of this like unorganized of stuff on the wall that ends in a piece, because that's sometimes how it feels like it's not very linear sometimes, I guess is what I mean.
You would think for sure, it's pretty standard to talk with students, or when we're learning something from a teacher and they talk about using a sketchbook, sketching our ideas. For the paper creations, before you make them in metal, was that something somebody taught you, or were you just trying to find a way to think things out with something that was easier to mess with than the metal?
Well, here's probably the genesis of that. When I was at North Carolina School of the Arts, one of the projects that we had was to create three-dimensional forms in paper, cubes, cones, cylinders. The professor that we had was very particular about perfection, which isn't a word that I actually think exists in the world, but we were supposed to be striving for something close to that. So we made a lot of these forms, right? For these three-dimensional forms to hold, we were using heavier paper. So I think that must have been the catalyst for me thinking about paper in 3 dimensions, understanding that I could use folds to create form, and then translating that into my design process. So I think that was probably where that started in my life.
That's really cool that it's over the years has become such a solid part of your process. And thinking about sculpture in all its forms, and paper sculpture is not what we would really think of. And then also thinking about jewelry as sculpture that you're wearing, all of that stuff. It's like a loop.
Absolutely. And right. And breaking out of what we think we know about materials and wearables and all those kind of things. Yeah. I mean, I think it's been one of the great quests of my life to get people to see jewelry as being sculpture.
And usually we're not taking a sculpture and like putting it through our earlobes, or like putting it around our neck.
Totally.
When you're talking about that feeling of when you were 17 and you're like, wow, this isn't what I thought it was. I thought I knew. And this whole world opened up. How would you describe that feeling? Was it delight or an amazement or something? I think those moments are very special because we're transitioning to the next place.
I'm going to use the word wonder. I think that as we get older, it can be hard to see the world through a lens that doesn't feel like it already understands it. Because that's part of what we're supposed to do is like, okay, this is what's going to happen next, but like that childlike wonder about something where you're like, wow, that's what I remember the most. Because I think it's because it's how I still feel. It's just like, oh, that is so cool that moves that way. And that for me, I'm totally simultaneously a rule follower, excuse me, and a rule breaker, both of those things. And so with metalsmithing, it was so amazing to realize that like I could start to understand the foundations of things and how they work and what the rules were, but then I could break them a little bit. So yeah, that's what I'm going to stick with is wonder and just fascination. And I think to me, those two things fall into the same bucket. When I go out into the world and I see a place that, I love to hike and be in the mountains. And there are definitely these moments of utter wonder and fascination that I feel all over myself when I'm having them.
Sometimes I feel like, how we might be having a hard phase or life seems gray or really challenging. And I'll think, okay, we know there's all different ways to turn that around for yourself, but I feel like doing things that will give you that feeling is one of the ways to turn it around, which then I think, well, what is that in a practical sense? It could be taking a class on something you never have, or like you're saying, a hike. And just, I don't know, it helps me feel a little bit of control over the gray if I can think about it that way.
And I feel really lucky that, like, for me, a lot of those experiences are tied back to my creative self. So the gray periods as a creative person to those slumps or dumps or quagmires or whatever we want to call them. Not always can I, but oftentimes either going out into the world and seeing something that just turns my brain on and ignites all of those feelings, or even still sometimes just sitting down at the bench. Like, and I'm going to jump over 5 steps and 10 steps back for a second, but early 2020, early pandemic, when things were really like, oh my gosh, what's happening? What is going on? There was certainly some really heavy times where I wasn't sure what to do. And it was really very much affecting my creative flow. And I also know that I have to be flowing, like I have to be working. I just sat down at my bench and started to saw out hands. No intent with the hands, just to be at the act of doing the thing that connects to my wonder and awe. And I still never did anything with the hands. I mean, it was the act of making them.
What you're describing is almost just being in motion in being creative without a push for a product helped you feel good.
Absolutely.
That's just very different than producing to sell for a craft show.
Oh, yeah. I think that it can be one of the biggest challenges to not be in production mode. If that's what you have to do sometimes, because I mean, I make my living selling jewelry. So I definitely have to make jewelry sometimes, like in a real intense way. And so, yeah, it can be hard to remember to just be in the process more. But I think that I've always felt that my hands were my best communication tool. They were the way that I could get things out, and so just like reconnecting them to me and to my brain during a time when I was really feeling, pretty disconnected and uncertain is how I knew sometimes maybe without even knowing that that's what I needed to do. And I've got a 9-year-old daughter and I would throw out a hand and she would come in and she would say, "Can I have this?" And I'm like, "Yes." Because once it was done, it was just done. And I find them every once in a while, like, cause I'm a mess. I'll be digging through a little tray of stuff and I'm like, oh, there's one of those hands.
That's so fun. Like little reminder tokens. It's one thing to love doing something and a whole nother thing to decide, I want to be a teacher in this and I want to make a business out of this. which also involves understanding accounting and how to repair your equipment, social media, and all the things. How
Yeah.
did you make the decision? How did you know? And when did you know I want to do this as my living, not just as a love?
When I graduated from school, had a metals degree, I was told that I had to get a real job. So I became a middle school art teacher. And I was teaching middle school art, and I was also teaching metalsmithing at a community college at night, but I wasn't making it all. 2.5, I guess, years passed. I had actually put a studio in my house, but I wasn't using it. The winter break of the third year that I taught middle school, I went out into my studio and I basically didn't come back. I started making and it felt so good, and I wasn't sleeping, but like in a good way. Brian, my partner, I remember coming out of the studio and saying to him, I'm not going back. Like, I was going to finish out that year as a teacher because I loved who I worked for, but that was the end. So he was like, wow, okay, big, huge life shift from the job with insurance and retirement and all those things, and security, and a whole list of other horrible stuff too, right? So I went to my principal the first day back to school, and I said, thank you for the opportunity. I've loved it so much, but I need you to know I'm not coming back after this year ends. I had to do that because I was jumping off of a cliff. Right. And so I had to fully and verbally scream out loud to the world, like, I'm jumping off this cliff and I'm doing it. So that happened. So that June, I finished up, or whatever it was, May, I finished teaching. I did keep the job teaching metalsmithing at night at the community college, and I started making. In the meantime, we had moved. I no longer had a studio. I was working on the dining room table in our 800 and something square foot house. It was the only table we had in the whole house, and I kept it covered with all my stuff. And people would come over and I'd throw a bed sheet over it to pretend. But anyway, that's all to say that I really did jump off that cliff, and I had no idea what I was doing. I did not know. My education prepared me to be a good metalsmith, but it didn't prepare me at all to be a person selling what I made, to be somebody in business. I applied for a couple of shows. The first show I ever did was in my hometown. I knew it probably wasn't exactly what I needed, but I was like, good practice, right? I'll set this booth up and it's close to home. And in the first 30 minutes, 4 things were stolen. You know what I mean? It was just what am I doing? And it was just a lot of throwing my energy at things and trying to figure it all out. Erica now reflects back, and only thing I regret is that I didn't reach out to the community of people that do what I do, because now it makes me want to cry, right? Now I know that it's this amazing community of people that would have helped, that would have answered questions, right? That would have been like, oh girl, no, don't do that, try this, or yes, great idea, or whatever. But I instead went the fail until you learn method. And that's what I did. Failed. And I think fail is a beautiful word, right? Because I learned a lot from it. Every once in a while, I'd have something go my way, and that felt good. And I was trying to do shows and trying to just get my work out there all the ways that I could. And over a lot of years and a lot of experiences, I slowly started to figure out how to be that artist maker that I always was, the person who brought me to the table, and also some of the other things. Never will I be all of the other things that it takes to be a small business owner, and be proud of me for that. And I know that everybody who's listening can't see my hands, but I keep doing this arcing motion. For a long time, they were 2 different people, and the artist person had a really hard time holding up and being proud of the one that was trying to figure out how to be in business. Brian, my partner, I had this business account, this business checking account, and I'd make a little bit of money and I'd put it in that business checking account, and I'd be so stoked that there was a balance, right? Like that there was money in the account, and I'd be feeling all good about it. But mind you, I was not ever paying myself any money at all. I was not making any income, and I was working like 80 hours a week or some wild mess. And I will not paint this picture well enough, but absolutely with love and kindness, he would say to me, honey, if you're not paying yourself anything, this endeavor it's not quite as in good shape as you think it is, because you should value yourself enough to pay yourself. And I mean, we had some version of that conversation 700 times. Do you know what I mean? Over a lot of years. And this is the part that I'm building to. This was when I think that for me, something shifted where I was like, I can be the maker that I am and also be in business in a way that can support me and my family. Because by this time, in all those years, I'd had 2 children, and then I've since had a third. The financial needs of our lives were growing and growing and growing. And so I had this, I've always called it a breaking moment, but in a good way, where it was like, I have to start valuing myself enough to pay myself and be honest with what that tells me about what I'm doing. And that's what I did. I came up with this little teeny monthly paycheck that I was going to pay myself. And I committed to it 100%. And I paid myself that little paycheck every month, no matter what. And I have to admit, I would think I was like scared to death that I was going to see that it wasn't going to work, but it did.
Maybe it's because we're so into the making part and we haven't done the business part before, and we just don't know yet. And I love what you're saying about there were so many people that would have helped. And also this is important to talk about too, because I hope people go check out, you have a great Instagram presence and you have really creative things you share there, and your website's wonderful. It would be easy for someone to see that and think, oh, well, that's all rocking, and you're like, yes, but there was all of this, which also gives us permission to go through all of that too. And maybe what we also would learn from this story is ask sooner, connect with your fellow people sooner that are trying to do the same thing. It could even be a different medium.
Oh, 100%. And maybe that's even better in the beginning. It's not about what you're making. It's not about your work. It's about the things that you're doing to get your work, yes, into the world and to pay your mortgage and, all the things. There was many, many years ago, I had a friend who did this really awesome thing where she shared this really, really beautiful photograph of her family. Everybody was just looking amazing, right? And the space that it was in was beautiful, and it was all the things, right? And then she took a photograph of what was behind what they were seeing, and it was chaos. I thought, what a gift that both of those things can be true. Beautiful, picturesque, all the things, and also utter chaos across the way, right? Because we are not typically all put. So for my version of that is that if, big if in my opinion, but if somebody were to look at me and think, wow, she's got it together or whatever, that's because it's utter chaos behind me. That's because that's blood, sweat, tears, like I said, fail. It's interesting to me that you bring this up to me, because just yesterday, somebody said, this was all on social media stuff, because I do use social media a lot for my business. I had posted something and somebody said something really nice, very nice compliment to me. And then somebody else said, yeah, I lay in bed thinking I just need to be more. And I was like, oh my God, no, it's like the exact opposite. Be kind to yourself, right? And give yourself space and hold yourself up in the long game approach to getting wherever it is you want to be. But all the I should and I have to be's, I think those are the things that go against us. They're the biggest barriers that we face.
I remember I had to get on, it was a Zoom call, kind of like a professionally type meeting thing. And I was just trying to be real cool, but I had just departed from a one-room studio where we lived while we built our house. The Christmas tree had fallen on the 6-year-old. I mean, you know what I mean? Like fallen completely. He was fine. It was not a big Christmas tree, but it was still very dramatic because of all of the pieces. And I'm like, I have to go. I have to go to this thing. And then my husband's like cussing in French because that's his language. And I just remember sitting on that meeting, just, oh my gosh, you don't even know what actually where I just ran away from, and all you can do is laugh, mostly, hopefully, because things really are fine.
Okay, that's
And
right.
also, it's why sharing and trading with people around us is so important, because really what we're often sharing are those funny stories and moments and the mess, right? And it reminds us everyone's a little bit of a mess.
Everyone.
We are not so special that we're the only one with a mess.
That's right. Right. Like your mess is not, in fact, the worst mess. No, you're not. So yeah, I love that perspective, anything.
Because I realized one day I was like, oh, this is just another way to be egocentric.
Like my bad is so bad.
My bad's really extra bad.
That's fantastic. I mean, that is such a true, when we're in it and we're feeling it, it feels so solo and so lonely and so ours that we forget. Yeah, no, I love you for that. I appreciate that perspective.
So 3 kids and everything.
Yes.
And when they were younger, of course, there's always a lot to do for caring and having fun and hanging out with kids. But when they're littler, it is very intense. And so how did you manage studio time and baby time and, especially when there's more than one to juggle and all of that?
I didn't.
There we go. The mess fail.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was the time. I mean, I think that was the time of my life when I started using the word balance, like all the time, like this quest for the enigma that is balance. Whatever you would call what I did, which I don't think I would call manage it. It was some combination of my partner's amazing and has always been phenomenally supportive. The picture that I paint, and I mean it in the best way, the picture that I hold in my mind is Brian, feet firmly planted on the ground, me floating above him, and him just gingerly holding onto my toe, like letting me be all the things that I want to be, but just there to support, right? And so that's a huge part of my story, is having somebody who would have that conversation I talked about earlier 750 times patiently until I could hear it. And yeah, but in a more literal sense, I am this feels funny to say out loud, but I'm a really hard worker. I just have my stress response is work, which I don't think is always good. So that's why I said it feels weird to say. I'm not saying that in a braggadocious kind of way. It's just more like, so I would mama all day and work all night. And I mean, I did many a craft show with a baby in the back of the booth. It wasn't horrible and it wasn't easy. There were great moments, and there's definitely been all of these times in my life where I'm like, I am showing my children that there is a way. No, I will never say to my kids, go get a real job. Not once, because it is a real job. This is a real job that has supported us and given us a good life. But, to speak to something different, that's more big picture. I know for me, and I think it's true for a lot of folks who make, my creative time is a kind of selfish time. I mean, I really get in my head when I'm making, and it's really, really challenging when that is disrupted over and over again. And so especially when they're little, when you're squeezing in that 1 hour nap time studio, or working at night, and then somebody wakes up. I think those were really, really challenging times because that creative self just wanted to stay tunnel visioned into what I was doing. And I remember reading sometime after my children were really, really little, that if you get interrupted when you're concentrating, it takes 15 to 20 minutes to get back to the level of focus that you had. And I was like, yeah, totally. Because there were times that I never got back to it.
For me, it's like what you're saying. That interruption is actually like physically painful.
But I would agree with you. The word hurt, it does a really good job kind of explaining what that feels like. For me, and I'm still practicing this that I'm getting ready to say, but I think there's so much pressure as a parent, maybe especially a mom, but I have not been a dad. So I'm just going to own the momness right now, to be like this most amazing parent to your children. That's what you want. You want to be all the things and all the time. And there was some point which somehow we often define as all sacrifice. And then somewhere along the way, I was like, but wait a minute. And this is the part that I still have to work really hard on. But I was like, but wait a second. I am also modeling life for my kids. Do I want them to think that it's their job to always sacrifice for the needs of others? I mean, yes, I want them to be kind and I want them to be all of those things, but I definitely want my children to value themselves and their needs and learn to communicate for themselves. And so I've been trying to be better about saying, I need this time. Just please, if you can, right? Especially during the last year and a half when everybody was virtual and everybody was home all the time, really value the boundary that I'm trying to create. Not because I don't love you and want you here. I'd love to be snuggling with you on the couch all the time. The reality is I need this.
And maybe the answer is not balance. Like you were saying, that's an enigma.
That's not a thing.
It's like impossible.
It's like balance and perfection, not a thing.
Like they don't even exist actually. So maybe it's like you were saying earlier, the answer is presence. So when we're with them, we're present with them. And when we're in our studio, we are present with that. And both are good.
And necessary and important to that bigger whole self, whole life picture.
So I know you love nature and everything. And also, I hope people can go see examples of your work because you are metals and minerals. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the place of nature in your work. And what do you think about the minerals you're choosing? Where do they come from? How did that side of your work in that earthiness come in with silver?
Early in my jewelry making, a lot of my work was like very cellular, literally about cells and cells dividing and organic materials. And I did a lot of work around that idea of the importance of these little teeny things and that they made up my body and your body and just patterns. I like to do a lot of research around my work. And so whether that be getting out in the world or doing research about certain cell types or looking at nano photographs of cells or whatever, you also start to see patterns, which also is fascinating to me, patterns and things that fit together. And so then you start to go out into the world and you see that pattern that you saw at the cellular level, you see it on the beach in the sand, and then you see it on the scales of a fish or whatever, so I started to realize that these ideas that interested me so much, these kind of foundational things like cells, that also I could see those on I could see them like on the cellular level, the nano level, and the human scale level. And I was like, whoa, bonkers, right? And so a lot of it was really organic like that. And then in 2010, I was working on ideas about the relevance of really small things within larger constructs. So body and cells, plant, seed pod, that kind of thing. And I did an artist in residence at the Grand Canyon, which was amazing because just to go back for a second to the mommyhood, my sons, I hadn't had my daughter yet, but my sons were 3 and 5, and I left for a month. And I went and lived on the ridge of the Grand Canyon, and it changed my beeping life. Anyway, could cry about that one too. I mean, it changed my life in 1,000 different ways. I started to make a shift in understanding that also the foundations or the building blocks of the earth, the rocks, the stones, the metals was, oh my gosh, because these are the materials that I use. I talk about the materials at hand. The things I touch also have this really amazing, like atomic, molecular, nano, human scale way that I can see them. And so when I go out into the world, that's how I see the world. I see that beautiful mountainscape, or the ice. Ice is also fascinating to me. And I think about it distilled back down into those little things that are making it happen in the first place. And I really love it because when you think about looking at things that way, suddenly, like at the Grand Canyon, I was the small thing. The canyon was the vast. And in that place, I was the little thing, and really starting to think about impact and who we are in the world that we live in and what we do. So nature is everything to my creative process. I then add to that my love of research and digging down and getting deeper. So then coming back home and looking at what beach sand looks like in a microscope will blow your mind. It'll blow your mind because there are little teeny shells that you can't even see that are there, but they're there. And so a lot of my, like this work, like these earrings, it's all based on the molecular and crystalline structure. So the things that are happening in the earth to make the crystals form, to grow the silver or form the silver. People laugh at me for saying grow, but form the silver or form the gemstones. It really amazes me to think about what's happening and how ordered and simultaneously chaotic it can be. So that's why my sketchbook is such an important, because it almost will look like a scientific drawing at first, because I've got all this, elemental stuff going on, and then evolving and translating it in to something like this, which for me is me distilling it back down into just how beautiful and amazing it is.
I love hearing about all this because there's no way hearing more in this way won't change how I see the work you make. It makes it even more special, and it's already visually special by itself.
At the end of the day, people could easily be like, she makes earrings. The catalyst for those earrings has a whole life of its own.
Tell us about your Working Knowledge series.
So Working Knowledge is a live interview show that I host on Instagram. I interview other artists. It's been the most amazing project for me in 1,000 different ways. When the pandemic really started to close things up, for me, because I do shows, I was getting cancellations like on a daily basis. But one of the things that was happening, because I work in my studio by myself, I don't have another studio mate or anything like that, was this very quick realization that I was not going to run into amazing people like you. Like I was not going to have those spontaneous interactions that lifestyle had given me. I knew that I wanted to talk to people. I knew that I wanted to be really intentional, that I was going to have to go out of my way, not like in a hard way, but just be really intentional about reaching out and talking to people. Not always good at that. So I was starting to formulate that idea, and I was feeling a little bit sorry for myself, to be honest. I open up my phone, I open up Instagram, and these two amazing Potter friends, Amy Sanders and Jen Mecca, they were doing a live. I had never even seen a live. I didn't even know what it was. It just, Instagram said they're live. And I'm like, okay, cool. Click on it. And they were just talking to each other and giggling and having a good old time. It filled me up. It was everything that I needed in that moment. And like in that second, I was like, yep. So this thing that I'm going to do that I still don't even really know what it is, it's going to be live. Because if me talking to some other amazing person can be that for anybody else, that's what I want it to be. I came up with the name Working Knowledge because I love words. I love kind of being sort of literal, and this idea of never meeting mastery, but in a good way. Like we're always working towards it. We're building the knowledge, we're honing it, and talking to people about that working knowledge, but also the knowledge of their work, right? So I'll do an interview this Thursday, which will be my 59th interview, which it blows my mind every time that this project has maintained. People are amazing. I mean, the gifts that I get from my guests every single time, I'm pretty sure were a pretty good, healthy part of what helped me through this last spans of time since the show started, because people would say things that it was like, oh, right, exactly. Or, oh my gosh, like you said that earlier. It's like, thank you so much for that perspective. I ask the same questions every interview. And what I really want is to see the arc of people's story. How did they begin doing what they do? When did they know they could do it professionally? I love that there you have this very similar question, is it a moment? Was it a trickle? We definitely talk a little bit about the pandemic and what things that they felt looking back. We do a little bit looking forward. And then I ask people to tell me a story, because though oftentimes as creatives, we are our work a lot of the time, I wanted there to be a question that was just whatever you want to tell me. You know what I mean? And I have cried. I have laughed so hard that later I felt like I had done an ab workout. It's been so cool to see what they share. It's been a cool experience for sure.
What is filling your inspiration cup these days?
I would still, but I definitely would have classified myself as what I would call a production jeweler for most of my career, really creating a lot of jewelry that I was either selling myself or selling through galleries and shops. And one of the things that really shifted for me the last couple of years was realize I call it the rabbit wheel. Like, I know it's supposed to be hamster wheel, but I mess everything up when it comes to saying, so I'm just owning my rabbit wheel. So that I was just like stuck on the rabbit wheel and I was not being kind to myself really. And so I really stepped off of it, or I was knocked off of it by the pandemic, and decided to try to make choices. One of those things was to really give back to making a lot more one-of-a-kind work. And that's really what's feeding me right now, is really full circle to what we talked about earlier, is spending more time with my sketchbook and with those investigations that I love so much. It's been so awesome because I love the research part so much and always have. I have a lifetime of collecting images and found objects and ideas, concepts, and so kind of going back to those things and spending some time with them and building out pieces that feel really good to make and really feel like they're really communicating some of the ideas that we talked about earlier. I've been thinking about water a lot, like solid, liquid, gas, but it's all the forms that things can take and trying to communicate some of those ideas. But also, like I've been having a lot more fun with my food too, experimenting more in my kitchen and giving myself space to have utter failures. That's been fun too, because I think sometimes talking about filling you up as a creative person, sometimes I think those of us who do it professionally almost have to step out of that thing that we do a little bit to be completely pressureless with our creativity. So yeah, I keep thinking that I'm going to start drawing more, but I haven't done that yet.
What are one of those recipes you've tried recently that did or didn't go so well?
There's a Thai dish called pad woon sen. That's like these big flat rice noodles in this dark, soy, wonderful. And there's usually some greens, and like I've had some pretty good, like it's not it, but it's delicious. Honestly, I have things that aren't successful pretty often. I'm vegan. So I'd like to do a lot of things with tofu and things like that. And I'd been reading about this fermented tofu that I was really intrigued to try. And so I got some like jarred fermented tofu. I clearly had not read enough about it and did not know enough about it, because I was like, I stir fried it into dish. Well, it was like cream cheese textured. Like the fermentation process had changed it. So that was a big old hella big fail. Like it was, I need to read more is what I'm saying. Like sometimes I need to be more informed before I go at something. So that was a big, like, we're not going to eat that because that did not go well. And nobody has to pretend, because my family, they're pretty nice and they'll be like, it's all right, Mom, you know.
Do you have any last words of encouragement for anybody out there just trying so hard to fold creativity and making and everything into their lives? You know, it's not easy all the time.
I would say really, really reach out to your community. If that's your home community or your creative community, but ask questions, be in the world. We actually are not supposed to know everything. So ask, you know, for help and ask for answers. Embrace failure. If you don't like that word, choose a different one. But everything we make is not a success. It's not supposed to be. Give yourself space to experiment in your work and have crash and burns. Same if you're pursuing a creative career. Also, you know that not everything's going to be a success. And that is not indicative of the scope of what that business can be or what that endeavor can be. I have a great friend, Tavia Brown. She's also a metalsmith. And early on in doing some live things, and it might have even been, I interviewed her for Working Knowledge. So we're on a screen like this, and she did this gesture where she held both of her hands together and she kind of put them towards the screen as if delicately holding something really precious. And for a lot of creative people, that's what it feels like when we put our work out in the world. And so every little interaction or lack thereof feels so personal. And then I think we can then therefore be so unkind to ourselves about lack of success or whatever we're saying to ourselves. So just say, be kind. And if you can embrace that not everything is going to go exactly the way you planned, and allow things to be an experiment versus being the thing, the finite end. This event is it, or this piece is it. And maybe that's just, if that's wisdom at all, maybe it's just because I've been at it a long time. And I have a billion things that failed and I have a billion things that succeeded. And so I know that the failures did not define me. I guess I'll leave it at that.
You got to be with yourself to the other side and see that you survived it just fine and that it's the only option. And so let's rejoice in it or something like that.
Yeah. And just so learning to be able to let go sometimes. And again, not get so wrapped up in what you're not being able to accomplish, but giving yourself space to start anew or reimagine.
If you would like to be in touch or have someone you would love to hear interviewed, email me at afainhouse@gmail.com. I also hope that you're inspired to rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast. New episodes come out every other Tuesday. If you would like to watch these interviews in video form and are curious about the happenings of my little business called Fain House, where I paint and make art prints and gift cards from my watercolor originals, I'd love for you to sign up for my email list. When you do, you get a coupon for 10% off a one-time purchase in my Etsy shop and first dibs on my annual limited edition calendar printing. You will also be granted access to our free private Facebook group, which is the one spot you can watch these interviews. If this all sounds fun to you, go to your web browser and type bit.ly/Fainhouse to sign up. That's with a capital F and a capital H in Fain House. This is not a weekly newsletter, but rather a list of folks who are interested in hearing from me time to time. You can find this link, as well as links for each person I interview, in the show notes of each episode. I'm Annie Fain Barrelon. Thanks so much for listening, and happy holiday times to you all. I'll leave you with a quote for the day. Every artist dips his brush in his own soul and paints his own nature into his pictures. Henry Ward Beecher.